WNYC Studios is supported by Grubhub. Sometimes getting to a so-called convenience store isn't actually very convenient. But now Grubhub delivers from local convenience stores. Whether you're in the market for snacks, paper towels, or drinks, Grubhub delivers them right from the convenience store to your door.
It can make a singer go silent and keep a boy from growing tall. Stress. On Radiolab. Listen wherever you get podcasts.
Hi, everybody. I'm Melissa Harris Perry, and this is The Takeaway.
A car driven by a Hasidic man went out of control, jumped a curb, eventually pinned the children against a wall. 7-year-old Gavin Cato dead, and his 7-year-old cousin seriously injured.
In August of 1991, 2 Guyanese children were hit by a car in the Crown Heights neighborhood of Brooklyn. The driver of the car was a member of the Lubavitch Jewish community and was driving in a 3-car motorcade carrying Rabbi Menachem Schneerson. 3 days of violent clashes followed after rumors spread that Jewish people involved in the car crash received medical attention ahead of the black children. Now, during the violence, a Jewish man was stabbed and killed, and a number of police officers and members of the community were injured. Afterwards, racial tensions continued to simmer between Jewish and black communities in Crown Heights. Collier Meyerson was only 6 years old at the time of the Crown Heights riot, but having grown up with a white Jewish father and a black mother, several parts of her identity were caught up in the events of 1991. Now, she's out with a new podcast revisiting what happened. It's called Love Thy Neighbor.
I lived in Crown Heights for close to 10 years in my 20s, and I never felt part of the Hasidic community. But what's interesting about this community is that they proselytize to other Jews. And they're the only Hasidic movement who does this. Actually, they're the only Jews who do this. And at the time I lived there, I joke with a friend of mine who's Irish that she got approached more than I did, me as a Jew. And the subtext of that joke, of course, was that they weren't approaching me because I was Black. And I think that there's been a concerted effort on the part of Chabad in recent years to change that. But at the time, I felt miles away from them. And on the other hand, I felt so embraced by the Caribbean American community. My neighbors knew me, my friends and family even. But through the making of this podcast, I came into the Lubavitch community and I found them to be incredibly open and kind.
I want to dig into that intersection that you've just identified for us, this sort of, oh, you don't look Jewish, sort of what it means to be Black and Jewish and in this space and trying to love your neighbors.
It's really interesting to look at these two communities through this sort of Black-Jewish relationship that is historic and seeing what that relationship meant to two groups of people who sometimes had nothing to do with the experience of Black Americans or of Jewish Americans who were involved in the civil rights movement. There is this long history of a Black-Jewish alliance. A lot of liberal Jews, and even not so liberal Jews, will hold up the memory of a rabbi named Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was a true civil rights hero and believed in Black uplift so deeply. But he is sort of used as this constant and sort of sole symbol of the possibility of Black-Jewish alliance. And that the Black-Jewish relationship is incredibly strong and real because Jews and Blacks have experienced oppression and have this shared oppression. And that we can rise up together and stronger through this shared history of oppression. But the truth of the matter is that white Jews who were not outwardly religious became to be perceived as white in the United States starting in around the 1940s, 1950s. And that, of course, doesn't preclude the very real reality of anti-Semitism, but it is important to distinguish, I think, between the constant experiencing of state violence and being the target of anti-Semitism by, sick individuals or groups of people. And of course, as a Black Jewish person myself, who is both Black American, not Caribbean American, and comes from a sort of secular Jewish background, my experience doesn't map out perfectly onto the Crown Heights community, but there are these modicums of sameness that I really wanted to explore.
Okay, now say more on the decision to look back on the Crown Heights riot at this moment.
So I think there's a macro reason, which has to do with taking a long lens to history. I had said in the very beginning of the podcast that I wanted to dissect the anatomy of a riot. So obviously, civil unrest doesn't come out of nowhere. And I think 30 years is a good amount of time to give space to a historical event that was so significant to this city and really to the country, so that it can help us see the present much more clearly. And then zooming in more closely to New York, there were serious political implications of the Crown Heights riot. I really do credit, I don't know, their aftermath to the rise of Rudolph Giuliani as mayor of New York City. And also, I was just frankly curious about the more existential question of what it means to be a good neighbor. So that was really what inspired me to look at this event that took place so long ago.
Did you come up with a way of describing what it means to be a good neighbor?
There is this idea, this like very American idea, that we need to love our neighbors, that we need to break bread with our neighbors. And in this particular community where Jewish people have really intense food restrictions, religious Jewish people have intense food restrictions, they can't break bread with their Black neighbors. And their very particular way of life is pretty prohibitive when it comes to like chilling with your neighbors. And so I think that we need to sort of like redefine what it means to be a good neighbor. Like, it doesn't mean taking all of these kind of external pressures that we grew up with, this sort of lore, American lore of loving your neighbor and becoming one, the sort of melting pot idea, but really just having a sort of like baseline of respect for your neighbor. It ends in this sort of positive way that I like do believe in the possibility of mutual respect and political organizing, even if you don't love your neighbor.
I appreciate the point about taking the long historic view. What is this moment that we're currently living in where we don't yet have the long historic view on these questions? I'm wondering what the stories you're telling us in the context of this podcast can tell us about this moment.
There have been, specifically in this community and then also in the country, a spate of anti-Semitic attacks in the last few years, and they have only risen. And I think they've also, specifically in this community in Crown Heights, have gone undercovered in the media. And of course, the death of George Floyd reinvigorated a movement that takes a deep look into police brutality and killings of Black Americans. So I felt like looking into the history of those two communities would give us answers that could help to figure out how these things repeat themselves. And of course, the answers are often the same, which is if you set up a community to fight for scraps, they will. And to individuate in ways based on race or religion or class, they will. And so the answer, I think, is a better social safety net.
Collier Meyerson is host of the Pineapple Street Studios podcast, Love Thy Neighbor. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm David Remnick, and each week on the New Yorker Radio Hour, my colleagues and I unpack what's happening in a very complicated world. You'll hear from the New Yorker's award-winning reporters and thinkers, Jelani Cobb on race and justice, Jill Lepore on American history, Vincent Cunningham and Gia Tolentino on culture, Bill McKibben on climate change, and many more. So please, never miss an episode. Listen to the New Yorker Radio Hour wherever you get your podcasts.